Hello and welcome to this special report edition, if you will, of the Daily Australian. We're going to have an interview for you in just a moment. Now, before we get started in today's interview with author and filmmaker Trevor Loudon, I want to refer you to a report that's come out overnight. And last night, it turns out that several people were denied entry to Box Hill Town Hall in Victoria, where Dan Andrews was scheduled to speak. Despite having valid tickets, some were denied entry, with very few exceptions, were white Australians, according to Morgan Jonas and Chris de Bruin of Discoveries. Now, people said that they knew for a fact, because they had Chinese Australian friends who were granted admission, that event staff were indeed allowing in people who had not booked tickets in advance if they happened to be of East Asian appearance. Why the double standard? What's going on with the Labor Party? I'll get you to have a look at this and then we'll get on with the show proper.
Happy to sign in. They're only allowing people of a very specific archetype in these doors. It's a closed doors meeting.
We're here to attend what's a public meeting, but apparently, if you've got a ticket, because it wasn't valid.
We just said that's not with us. That's not part of this event.
I've got my ticket. I rang up and I confirmed it, and I'm happy to sign in and give my details.
Yeah.
And I'm here to, got this in the mailbox about...
So you got this in the mailbox. Are you local?
Yes.
So is it Matt Gregg, your filmers?
Local. So I'm here to speak to him.
There you go.
And they still won't let me in to see what he's got to say.
Unbelievable. So locals are getting these in the mail, and they're coming here, registering their name, registering their address, talking to the police, not being allowed in closed doors. Penny Wong, why has Labor been restricting freedom of speech for Australians? Can you answer to that? Why weren't Australians allowed in tonight to this event? Why were only Chinese people allowed in?
Extraordinary, isn't it? There you saw Trevor. I'll bring him in just a moment. I just want to ask you a couple more questions before we get into the interview proper. Is climate change a religion or a cult? Is compulsory medicine really the future? Is digital ID and total surveillance on your bingo card? When did society switch from free will to hive-mindedness? Are we better off in any way, or are we just meant to feel safer? One thing we have learned over the past 5 years at least is that the more we want to be left alone, the more we are being controlled for our safety and our convenience. So with a looming federal election, with distrust of mainstream politics at an all-time low in Australia, with an incumbent Prime Minister going back on his word for a COVID Royal Commission and overseeing a cost of living crisis, where young people have all but given up on the Australian dream, who is Anthony Albanese under the facade of the Aussie battler, who's never had a real job in his life, an idealist, or something more sinister? Is Albo the perfect puppet for a grander global agenda? Well, Trevor Loudon is an author of 9 political expose books, including Stealth, Kamala Harris's Communist Roots, Reds, Socialists and Security Risks Running for US President, Barack Obama and the Enemies Within. His latest book is COMRADE, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's 40-year alliance with Australian communism. He's also a filmmaker and public speaker from Christchurch in New Zealand for more than 30 years. He's researched the radical left, Marxist and terrorist movements and their covert influence on mainstream politics. His websites are trevorloudon.com and kiwiki.org. Trevor Loudon, welcome to the Daily Australian.
Well, great to be here, Jason. Thanks for having me on, and greetings to the audience.
Well, Trevor, thank you for coming onto the show today, and your wisdom and your life's work is certainly going to be put to the test, if you will, what we're seeing right now. Now, I thought it was appropriate at the head of this interview to play something there. What do you think, just as an observer with a lot of experience in researching, what was your take on that short video clip that we saw out of Victoria last night?
Well, I noticed that Daniel Andrews was supposed to be on the bill, and so was Karina Garland. Daniel Andrews is extreme left, in bed with China for a very long time, and Karina Garland is very, very close to the Search Foundation, the continuation of the old Communist Party of Australia. And both of these, what they've been doing is really courting ethnic minorities, and that's part of the reason for the big upsurge in migration during Albanese's term, because the goal is to, as they have done in Canada, to import millions of Chinese and similar people into the country, not because of their race so much, but because of their political affiliation, their political background, their connections to the CCP and other foreign governments. And this is part of the subversive process for turning Australia into a socialist, well, dash communist nation. So it was quite interesting to see Karina Garland, Daniel Andrews, and making sure that only ethnic people were getting into the meeting, because the ethnic people are the main target for the left. That's immigration bears that out, but not just immigration. There's two systems in Australia, one for your traditional Australians and one for minorities, and that's always been a part of the Marxist program.
I tell you what, there would be people watching, tuning into this and realizing that those remarks, as startling as they sound, it seems, Trevor, that you've picked this up from years and years of research. I mean, you just picked it straight away.
Well, I've been doing this for 40 years. The communists have a thing, they call it the nationalities question. Stalin realized that you couldn't always just use the class struggle for revolution. Sometimes it was more productive to use minorities for a revolution. So it's actually a very scientific program. The nationalities question, if you don't have minorities in a country, you import them, and then you build up their rights, and you create friction with the native population, and you just get a chaotic situation developing, which the socialists then take advantage of. So it's a very scientific process. This is not new, and it's carried out all over the world, not just Australia.
Well, that was my next question, because it appears that this is a method or a plan or an agenda that's crossing all Western nations. And of course, the open borders scenario that we saw in the United States abruptly ended by Donald Trump's new administration. Does that therefore tell you that there is, at least in the US, we're seeing the globalist agenda, if you will, mirroring what you're saying is the communist agenda, and Donald Trump's certainly not a communist and definitely a nationalist, that we now have a resistance?
Well, the communist movement and the globalist movement overlap considerably. China is really the enforcement arm of the globalists. And so communist China is promoting this, like in the United States, it is the pro-Chinese communists that have pushed for the open borders. They are the immigration groups. They are the groups that hire lawyers to defend illegal immigrants. They are the people who pressure politicians to keep the borders open. This is a Chinese operation in America. So it's also a Chinese operation in Australia, and but in New Zealand as well. So they've deliberately imported lots of minorities into New Zealand. Then they stir up the native Maori population, and land rights, and just like they're doing with the Aboriginals here. So the goal is to balkanize the country. So you're not all Australians anymore. You are different groups. And these groups have competing interests, just like, the classes, the working class is supposed to have a different interest to the capitalist class. Well, that's old fashioned. That's a bit bulky. That doesn't work very well. But when you can balkanize a society, when you can get different ethnic groups and religious groups competing against each other, some getting favored by the government, some not being favored by the government. Like anybody who's had a family knows, if you want to destroy your family, treat your kids differently. You treat your kids differently, your family's going to fly apart. Treat your different groups and, exacerbate these differences. Introduce legislation that treats certain groups differently, like the voice referendum was intended to do. You do that, you're going to balkanize the country, you're going to tear the country apart, and that's what the revolutionaries are after.
That is really interesting, and yet many will say that it's fairly obvious. But if we then juxtapose that against the entire trans agenda that we saw literally just burst out of nowhere, does that therefore for you draw similar comparisons therefore?
Yeah, look, the revolution used to be workers versus the bosses. Now the revolution is the sexual minorities versus the straights. That's gays, lesbians, but now gone even further into the transgender movement. Now some of the transgenders are fighting some of the gays, you know. So this is a process of fractionalizing the country. So now the Marxist revolution is driven through the transgender movement, through the Aboriginal voice movement, through the ethnic minorities movements, through some of the Muslim extremists, through the environmental movement. So communism, Marxism is very prevalent in Australia. It's very, very powerful. But because it's working in all these different sectors, people don't recognize it as the old communism of the past. It's what they call intersectionality. You know, the race struggle is connected to the class struggle, is connected to the gender struggle, is connected to the LGBTQ struggle, is connected to the environmental struggle. All these struggles overlap, but they're all Marxist driven. Every single one of them is Marxist driven. You know, the immigration upsurge in Australia is a Marxist program to bring more votes in for the left, to balkanize the country, to increase tensions and increase general dissatisfaction, which will then be preyed upon will be utilized by revolutionary forces.
Is it fair then to draw the comparison that any Marxist revolution, as you've sort of divided it into different categories and subjects, is always the collectivism of the perceived weak against the perceived strength? Therefore,
yeah, it is. Like okay, the old class struggle was the capitalists have all the wealth, right? But there's more. The workers are being oppressed. Their wealth is being stolen. They produce the wealth, but the capitalists steal it. Now it is the minorities are oppressed by the white Christian capitalist patriarchy. The women are oppressed by the male patriarchy, the male system. They're victims. Everybody is a victim. So if you want a revolution, you create as many victims as you can, and you turn the victims against those who currently occupy the power structure. You know, so that's how it is. It's the same. It's a Marxist principle applied to gender, applied to sexuality, applied to the environment, applied to racial conditions, but it's still the same Marxist agenda: the powerless against the powerful. So you want as many powerless people as you can, and you vilify anybody who's seen to have a little bit of power. Whether they do or not is really irrelevant. And that's how you get a revolution. And a lot of Australians don't sort of think of a Marxist revolution as being on the agenda. But, you know, we almost saw a complete communist program, the voice referendum, permanently changed the constitution of your country. It came pretty close. And for a long time, people thought it would win. And thanks to the no vote and the people who organized that, it didn't. But that was probably a few hundred communists were on the verge of changing your constitution forever. They have a lot of power, way more power than their numbers would tell you.
It seems that way. It also seems that in psychological terms, and I only mentioned it today on the Daily Australian Radio Show, what I did call the drama triangle. If you imagine a triangle, three-tip triangle, of course, one corner you have the victims, another corner you have the rescuers, and at the top you have the persecutors. And it seems that in said drama triangle, it's always going to be 2 versus 1. If you can have those that have a perceived feeling that they need to provide for the victims. And this is the crazy thing about left-wing politics, is that it is, as much as it preaches egalitarianism, it's the opposite. It's creating a hierarchy in real time that whilst you might not be doing very well, there's always someone worse off than you that you need to help, therefore.
Yeah, look, that's right. And you only expiate the guilt of being white or being a business owner or whatever privileged position you happen to be in by devoting your time to helping the downtrodden. You know, like in America, you know, young white college kids have to practically genuflect to Black Lives Matter to expiate their white guilt. You know, so but the hierarchical point is great, because in a free, open society, every society has hierarchies, but in a free, open society, they're very flexible. You can move up or down depending on your merit. But in a socialist society, those hierarchies get locked in. There's no more hierarchical society than the socialist society. Because you look at Kim, Rocket Boy in North Korea, one of the richest men in the world, but most of his people live in abject poverty. And the only thing that keeps him in power is that strata of military and police that enforces his dictates. So socialism is not about equal sharing of the wealth. Socialism is about concentrating all wealth and all power in very few hands. All this wealth sharing, power sharing, that's just to get the people stirred up. That's just to get the people on board. But the professional revolutionaries know that when the revolution comes, they're going to be on top, and they're going to be driving the Mercedes, and they're going to be eating the caviar and the steaks, while everybody else is living in the co-op eating mung beans and biking to work in the morning.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? It's the great paradox of a system that's meant to explain what is supposed to be fair for everyone.
The results are the opposite of what they say they are. Exactly the opposite. And you don't have to be in the communist movement too long to understand that this is what you're about.
And yet the engine room of developing new interest in communism always seems to be in the tertiary institutions, the universities, and where it is that those that are becoming educated and are being allowed, supposedly through the structure of university, to begin to think for themselves, also in most situations are starting out with an empty plate of asset creation, if you will, with no wealth. They're high school students becoming young adults, etc. And so it stands to reason that they want to come up with a better system because they realize that the one they're in is imperfect, and so it's always presented in this way. So it just seems like a logical breeding ground, if you will, for this to continually, generationally, always next generation, there's going to be another bout of people in communism, socialistic circles following Marxism being taught that way.
And I think 80% of communists in Australia or New Zealand, they get recruited in university. That's your normal path. You get recruited in university. You become part of the student executive, the student government, and then you get a job working for a Labor MP or a Green MP, and then you become one yourself. That's the revolutionary path in Australia.
Well, isn't that appropriate, therefore, that the subject of our discussion today, Trevor, is your brand new book? I'm going to put it there on the screen for people to have a look at. It's called Comrade Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese's 40-Year Alliance with Australian Communism. Well, Trevor, tell us about Albo and his brush with communism, therefore, in Australia.
Well, it's not a brush, it's an ongoing commitment. But, it started in the 80s when he was at the University of Sydney. He was very much involved with people like Professor Frank Stilwell and others who were in the orbit of the Communist Party. And he was deeply in the orbit of the Communist Party of Australia. He worked with them. They were his friends, probably a secret member at some point, but he was a rising star in young Labour left at the time. In 1990, the Communist Party of Australia dissolved and reinvented itself as the Search Foundation, a foundation based out of Sydney, seeded with about $3 million of Communist Party of Australia money. And the goal of the Search Foundation was, by not being openly communist, to be able to infiltrate the left wing of the ALP left, and the Greens and the ACTU and other social movements much more effectively. Anthony Albanese has worked with the Search Foundation from day one. He has followed their dictates. He has employed their people. He has followed their policy programs. Even his current chief of staff, Tim Gartrell, one of the most powerful people in America, is a Search Foundation comrade. Former General Secretary of the Labor Party, darling of the Labor left, Tim Gartrell is a member of the Search Foundation, the descendant of the Communist Party of Australia. And some will say, okay, they were communists then, but now they're more democratic socialists. Well, the Search Foundation still works with Sri Lankan communists, with Filipino communists, with Cuban communists. They've even helped to bring Cuban communists here to start education programs in Aboriginal communities to radicalize the Aborigines. So this is a communist group. And Albanese has supported this group, worked with this group, employed people from this group, and follows their policy direction today. And that process started over 40 years ago and has never wavered. He has always been in their camp.
What I found astounding in Australian politics is modern Labor, when you consider maybe going back to 1983 and Bob Hawke and the Hawke-Keating government, was very much what you would call, right of centre, if you can, with it, certainly within the Labor movement. And it was always that the right faction would be the leader of the party, but it wasn't really until Julia Gillard emerged in the collapse of Kevin Rudd, which was seen as a revolution and very, very quickly plummeted and was replaced. So we saw our first left faction candidate become Prime Minister, and then that went on for Albanese to be the second Prime Minister in a short period of time to go that way. Now, is this a case of it being taken over, or do you think it's more accidental that the Labor Party would do anything for its survival and now just seems to fall into this communist agenda that we're seeing around the world emerge as globalism?
No, look, it's very, very planned, very consistent. The ALP left, this is Tom Uren, people like that, who was, Albanese was mentored by Tom Uren and Arthur Getzelt and these people, Bruce Childs, all of whom were involved with the Communist Party, all of whom were secret communists working inside the ALP. They picked out Albanese. At the same time, the Search Foundation began a big infiltration of the Labor left, the ALP left faction. And in 2019, I think it was, they finally were able to take over the Labor Party executive, to get a majority on the executive. Now, Julia Gillard absolutely came out of this. She was heavily involved in a Marxist group in Melbourne for many years, the Socialist Left, a proper Marxist group that came out of the Communist Party. But Albanese was really the one who was supposed to finish the job. So they got into the Labor Party, especially in New South Wales and Victoria. New South Wales, Sydney, his Albanese's territory. And they promoted him and others like Penny Wong, like, several of his cabinet ministers, Linda Burney being a classic example of that, deep Communist Party connections going back years. And so we are now at the time, not just where the left of the Labor Party is in control, the hard left, Albanese's hard left faction of the ALP left now runs Australia. That has never happened before. This is not Bob Hawke. This is not Keating. This is not even what's the guy got?
Kevin Rudd.
Yeah, it's not even Kevin Rudd. This is the hard left Communist Party faction of Labor is now in control. They have the ACTU is completely under control of the Search Foundation. The Australian Manufacturing Workers Union is also under their control. CPSU is under their control. So all the major unions and the left of the ALP are all run by this little clique of communists that has put Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong in power. And now they're acting out the agenda. The voice referendum, which, even Thomas Mayo, the voice of it, he's a Search Foundation member. He was mentored by Fred Manning, the famous Brian Manning, the famous Darwin Communist Party member who then joined the Search Foundation. He was the mentor to Thomas Mayo. That whole voice referendum was run by the Search Foundation, completely, 100%. And it almost changed Australia's constitution. All the environmental policies that Albanese is enacting, they come from the Labor Environmental Action Network, which is controlled by the Search Foundation. Look, everywhere you look in his policy directions, you can see a direct link back to the Search Foundation. He even wrote a book after COVID, during COVID, about what comes next. Albanese contributed to a book called What Comes Next. Look it up on Amazon. And it was all about how we would use COVID to implement socialism in Australia. And over, I think, nearly a half of the other contributors in that book were from the Search Foundation. This was a communist book, and he contributed and wrote the foreword to it and launched this book. So the Search Foundation agenda, through the Labour left and through the Greens, they control the Greens as well, is now in charge of Australia, and that is a pure Communist Party agenda, purely Communist Party.
Now, we know that Rahm Emanuel, who worked for Barack Obama, said never waste a good crisis, or words to that effect. Do you believe that COVID was therefore an opportunistic scenario, therefore, for Albanese and the Search Foundation, etc., to take advantage of this, or could they have had prior knowledge, or that this was always something that was always going to come?
Well, I think they certainly took advantage, just like Jacinda Ardern, another Marxist, took advantage of it in my home country, New Zealand. I live in the States now, but I'm from New Zealand, as you would know by the accent. But yes, look, they are prepared. And I don't know if they had prior knowledge, you know, obviously it came from China, but I do know, here's a point to ponder. Victoria had the harshest lockdowns in Australia, I think, under Daniel Andrews. He is the most pro-Chinese premier. The unions in Victoria are the most under the control of the Chinese. All over the world, where you saw the harshest lockdowns, that's where the Chinese had the most influence. So they gave us a disease, then they used their subservient politicians and the unions which they controlled to enforce the lockdowns, to inflict maximum damage on our economy and to get the people more subservient. So whether they had advantage, prior knowledge or not, I don't know, but they certainly used the COVID to push policies they wanted to push. It was an excuse for more socialism. And look, read the book. What comes next? Albanese's one of the contributors. Most of the other contributors are well-known Search Foundation Marxists, and they lay out their whole agenda: environmental, economic, foreign policy. This is what we can do with COVID. And it all comes from the Marxist Search Foundation. And here's Anthony Albanese writing a chapter and launching the book. That should tell you who is running the direct policy direction of the Labour Party.
Indeed. Trevor, I want to put up on the screen some pictures of some other book titles that you've written, and then I'm going to ask you probably what will be the final question. You've written books on Kamala Harris, her communist roots, called Stealth, Barack Obama, and White House Red. So this is something that, based on the work that you've done over a lifetime, you've obviously picked up the patterns. So based on that, just quickly on the American scenario, can you just paint a picture for us by comparison to what you learnt in Australia?
Well, look, this pattern is playing out in New Zealand, Australia, in the United States. Heavy use of racial minorities to change government policy. You see that in the States with the black population and the increase of immigrants and the Native American population. You see that in Australia. You see that in New Zealand. Open borders and mass migration. You know, that is to change the demographics and the voting patterns of the country. And in all three countries, especially in the United States, this is orchestrated by the Chinese communists. There are Chinese communist networks on the ground working in the illegal immigrant networks, and this is driven by the Chinese Communist Party from overseas. And I believe exactly the same is happening in Australia. This is a revolutionary situation driven by the Chinese, which is and you got Penny Wong, a complete Marxist, the most Chinese-friendly foreign minister you've had for decades, with the most Chinese-friendly prime minister you've had for decades, kowtowing to China. When they have exercises off your coast, what does Albo do? When the Chinese Navy hurt some of your divers off the Philippines, fires a sonar while they're underwater, damages their eardrums. What do they do? Nothing. When they are, the last government was trying to shut down the Confucius Institutes in Australia. No, that's all stopped now. This is the most China-friendly government you've had. Kamala Harris and Tim Walz were both pro-Chinese communists in the United States. And the last Prime Minister of New Zealand, Chris Hipkins, was a pro-Chinese Maoist, as was Jacinda Ardern. So the Chinese are using the existing Labour Party structures, the existing Democratic Party structures, using the control of unions, which they control in all three countries, and then using their influence in the existing political parties to put their people in power to move policies favorable to them. So I see this in all three countries, plus Britain, plus Canada, plus many other places around the world. So it's no accident that the most communist prime minister you've ever had, even worse than Gough Whitlam, is now so soft on China. So absolutely soft, because he's on their team, and so is Penny Wong, and so are many of his cabinet, and so is the leadership of the ACTU right now. You know, Sally McManus, the head of the ACTU, is a former Search Foundation vice president. You know, they control the unions, they control the Labour left, which means they control the whole Labour Party, and they control the Greens. This small communist group controls all of those forces, and they gave you this prime minister.
So who's pulling the strings therefore at the global level? Is it China, or is it World Economic Forum Western interests, for example, if they are in fact two different groups?
Well, this might contradict what some people think. Look, the World Economic Forum is, in my opinion, a puppet of the Chinese. Now, look, Klaus Schwab has a bust of Lenin in his office. Klaus Schwab has very deep ties to the Chinese and has done for some time. Now, you might say that he is the puppet master or some globalists and they control the Chinese. I think it's more the Chinese control them. But either way, it's not a healthy situation for us. You know, they work in tandem. They work together. You know, the World Economic Forum is to sort of bring people into the business people into the socialist movement. But I believe if the Chinese Communist Party collapsed tomorrow, the World Economic Forum would also collapse. If the World Economic Forum collapsed tomorrow, the Chinese would just build another one.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Just like they control the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization is completely controlled by the Chinese. Tedros, the head of it, is an Ethiopian Maoist, pro-Chinese communist put in place by the CCP, and the head of the compliance unit, the unit that propagandizes to make people accept their dictates, is Susan Mickey of the British Communist Party, a long-time Chinese supporter. So, you know, China has these fronts: World Economic Forum, World Health Organization, the ACTU, the left wing of the Australian Labor Party, and that's why the Australian Labor Party is tilting and pivoting towards the minority in the Chinese communities in this country, because that's their constituency. That's the friend of their friend. Those people were sent here. You know, you can't come to a foreign country from communist China unless you have the blessings of the authorities. They only send the people here they want to have here, the people who will toe the line. And now they're in there and voting Labor in certain constituencies.
So then how do you compare, therefore, in Australia, we're headed towards a federal election. Both Albanese looks weak, but his competitor also looks weak. How do you compare to the return of the Trump administration and its importance, therefore, as a resistance, it would seem, against globalism and communism?
Yeah, well, I think that the Trump administration is very important. You know, look, all the Chinese had to do was get Kamala Harris in. Then they were going to get the government to legalize 40 million illegal immigrants who would have voted 80% Democrat, and you would have had a one-party state under Chinese control. Very simple. So it's the fact that Trump has stopped that is critical. The fact that Trump is fortifying the economy, he's decoupling from China, He's challenging China. That is vital. And I just want Australian politicians, New Zealand politicians to be like Trump. Just be out there and fight and fight and fight for your country. Because if we don't fight now, we're going to lose our nations. We're going to lose our countries. Our children are going to grow up under Chinese domination. And as a parent, I can't bear the thought of that. You know, we've got to fight. And Trump is the inspiration. It can be done. If Trump can do it, why can't an Australian politician? Why can't a New Zealand politician, a British politician? And I think he is inspiring a lot of people around the world, from Milei and Argentina and others, to accept that the old ways of doing things have led us down the garden path, and we got to do stuff differently now, and we got to be bold and courageous. Courage is the word going forward. We are crying out for courageous leaders. We're all crying out for that.
Isn't it extraordinary that the conservative movement have become the radicals, if you will, and the progressive movement have gone back to good old communism to usher in their plans? After all, it seems that everything that we know, ideology, is being turned on its head. And at the same time, the anti-establishment presidency of Donald Trump is the one that the establishment has somehow gone on it against its own interests. For the United States, land of the free, home of the brave, to want to embrace open borders and a communistic state, feels like that's no wonder we're headed down this one world government globalist pathway. It's just an extraordinary situation that we've ended up in.
Yeah, we are living in very unusual times. But I've always said, you know, this isn't really left versus right. This is the concept of the common man running his own life, individual sovereignty. You know how to run your life best. Australians should control Australia. Sri Lankans should control Sri Lanka. Fijians should control Fiji. You know, that's the radical idea that we're fighting for here. And the globalists, the elitists, there's always been this strain in human society, think they know best, and we should be grateful to give up our freedom to them, because they'll run our lives better for us than they will. That arrogance that's always been there. Well, communism gives, and globalism gives, those arrogant people the actual power they need to do stuff. So we're coming into a big crunch point here. The globalists and the communists are more powerful than they have been, but the grassroots people all around the world are rising up. Populist movements are springing up everywhere, and Trump has been a great champion of that, has inspired people all over the world. So I think this, in 10 years' time, the world is not going to be the same as it is now. It's either going to be a hell of a lot worse or a hell of a lot better. One of the other. And I'm very, and I'm not out there stumping for the coalition or whatever, but I just want to tell Australians, from my research, Anthony Albanese is a communist. Most of his cabinet are communists. And if you thought he was bad in his first term, you wait to what he does in the second term, because that's when the bad stuff will really come out. That's when the immigration will ramp up. That's when he's flooded the country with so many new people that you can never elect an opposition government again. Just demographics alone. They will be grateful to the person who let them in. They will vote for that party, and you will have a one-party state in Australia. The voice will come back. That will give a small bunch of communists veto power over your parliament. If you think it was rough under Albanese, you have seen 10% of what he's planning for this country. And he's going to do it if he gets a second term. The communists, they always do the moderate thing in the first term, sort of moderate, but they go hardcore revolutionary second term. That's what Chavez did in Venezuela. Exactly the same playbook.
It seems obvious, doesn't it? And the try-on, if anything, the trial close was the voice. We'll put the referendum up. That'll be the big victim rescuer scenario. And then we'll try something a little bit more subtle, whether that be an inheritance tax or something like that, quoting on the fact that the government needs more money to support probably the NDIS or something like that. Yeah, will be the argument, at least.
Yeah, look, you have the old Communist Party of Australia of the 80s now in charge in your country. And they are going to push it as far as they can. They want full-on socialism in Australia, full-on. And they've got their man. If they can get their man back in, you're going to get it. And if you think it's tough now, you wait and see what it's like in 2 or 3 years' time. So I'm not promoting a certain party. I'm just telling you, get Albanese out, because he is not your traditional Labor politician. He's not Bob Hawke. He's not Keating. He's not Rudd. He's none of those. He is a communist. He's Stan Sharkey, or that's what he is. He is a hardcore communist who has scammed his way into the leadership of the Labor Party, and he will do massive damage to your country if he's not defeated in May. I think this is a great chance here for Australians to stop this, because you're all going to regret it like hell if you don't, I can assure you. And it's not everybody. See, Trump needs Australia to confront China. Australia is super important in the Pacific. New Zealand needs Australia. We can't do anything without Australia. We need a free, stable, tough Australia guarding the South Pacific. We need them to keep China out of our area. Well, Trump needs that. He needs that help. He can't confront China so effectively without Australia's help. Well, he's got a big problem right now, because he's got China's man in Canberra right now. He's got their man, not Australia's man, in there. So if Trump could have at least a conservative or someone who isn't a communist, I think that would be a lot better for America, a lot better for Australia, a lot better for New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, Philippines, all of us. We're all going to be better off without a communist running Australia.
It's a really interesting point you make, because we've only learnt this week that Trump has imposed the tariffs on Australian aluminium and steel, and you would therefore think that that's going to weaken Albanese in the eyes of the electorate in the lead up to the election. And it's given Peter Dutton, certainly the opposition leader, a little bit of chance to have a dig back at Albanese, who's been after Dutton for financial irregularities, if you will. But Dutton's saying he can't even get Trump on the phone. So that looks like politics is all about theatre and optics. It's an incredible scenario that we're in, Trevor.
Look, it's very, very hard to figure this out, isn't it? Just what the games are being played here. But we got to change what we can change, and Australians have an opportunity to change Australia for the better in a couple of months' time. And I put the book out to get as many Australians to understand as possible that if they vote for Albanese, they're not voting for the Labor Party of Bob Hawke. They are voting for a communist party. And if they understood that fact, they would not do it. And so, that book's 398 pages or 392 pages, full of photographs, full of communist documents, full of all sorts of evidence that's never been presented to the Australian people. You don't come to a foreign country and tell people their leader is basically a traitor, unless you have the evidence to back it up. And, I've had a lot of people proof that book, and nobody's said to me, Trevor, you can't back that up. This is in their own words. These are their own documents. I've done some pretty deep dives on these people, and it ain't just Albanese, it's Bernie, it's a whole bunch of his cabinet ministers. This goes way beyond Albanese. He's just the top of the top of the iceberg, basically.
There you go. Fantastic, Trevor. One more time, I'll put up on the screen for people. Where can they purchase?
Just go to Amazon. It's available on Amazon, on Talking Book, Kindle, or hardcover, or paperback, and it's going very well, I've got to say. But Amazon is the best way to get it.
Brilliant. There you go. Trevor Loudon, thank you so much for your time today. Best of luck with the book, and thanks for the encouraging words of advice for people thinking about who they're going to vote for, who they're not going to vote for in the upcoming federal election.
Look, it's a pleasure. I think we all want Australia to be free and prosperous. That helps the Kiwis, that helps everybody, and we have a chance to do that. So thank you so much, and thanks for giving me the opportunity.